There is an episode of South Park where a 10-year-old boy engineers the murder of another kid's parents, grinds them into chili, serves them at a festival, and then drinks that kid's tears while calling them yummy. The episode has a 9.6 rating on IMDb, one of the highest scores any television episode has ever received on that website. Not any animated episode, any episode of anything. That is what we are talking about today. South Park has been on television for 27 years. It has been banned by a world government, threatened by extremists, censored by its own network, and just signed a deal worth $1.5 billion. It has changed how courts rule, how people vote, and what a major religion is allowed to keep secret. No other cartoon has done any of that. Welcome to East Park. If long-form breakdowns of the shows that actually change things are what you are here for, subscribing takes 3 seconds and it genuinely helps. Let us get into it. The 6-Day Machine. How South Park's production process made every other cartoon obsolete. Picture the newsroom of any major newspaper. Reporters chasing stories as they break. Editors cutting copy down to the bone at midnight. A finished paper landing on doorsteps while the ink is still warm. That is the speed other news organizations dream about. It is the speed South Park actually operates at. Every other animated show on television works on a timeline that would make a newspaper editor cry. The Simpsons, Family Guy, and most other cartoons you can name take somewhere between 8 and 9 months to produce a single episode. The process involves hundreds of animators, most of them working in studios in South Korea, drawing every frame by hand. The writers finish a script. That script goes overseas. Months pass. The episode comes back. By the time it reaches your screen, whatever it was originally about has been buried under a pile of news cycles, cultural moments, and conversations that already happened without it. The episode about a trend that was everywhere last year airs when that trend is already embarrassing to talk about. The political joke lands 6 months after anyone stopped caring about the politician being mocked. South Park figured out how to make this entire process look ridiculous. Not by being smarter than those shows, though it often is, not by having a bigger budget, because it doesn't, but by building a machine that runs on almost nothing and moves faster than anything else in the history of television animation. The machine works like this. Every episode of South Park, every single one, from the scripts to the finished animation to the sound to the final edit, gets built in 1 week, from scratch. Trey Parker and Matt Stone and their team of about 70 people sit down on a Thursday and start working. By the following Wednesday night, a complete 22-minute episode of television has been written, voiced, animated, edited, mixed, and sent via satellite to Comedy Central's headquarters in New York. Sometimes it arrives just a couple of hours before it goes on air. That is not a production trick or a shortcut. That is the entire model of how the show operates, and it has been doing this for over 2 decades. The early seasons were not always this fast. When South Park first started, episodes still took several weeks to put together, but as the team got better and the tools improved, the timeline kept shrinking. Eventually, they realized they could do it in a week. Then they realized they could do it better because of the deadline, not despite it. Parker and Stone have both said that the pressure of the 1-week schedule is part of what makes the show funny. When you have to make decisions fast, you make bolder ones. You stop second guessing. You stop polishing things until they're safe. You just put it out there while it still has heat on it. The documentary about this process, called 6 Days to Air, follows the team through the production of a single episode. It was nominated for an Emmy Award. Critics who watched it described the experience as being unable to look away from how intense and strange the whole operation is. The entire writing staff described the pace as exhausting and relentless. Parker himself has said that he usually feels completely burned out the moment an episode is finished, only to start the whole process over again the next morning. What this machine produces is something no other animated show can touch. South Park can put a joke about something that happened Monday on television by Wednesday night. No other animated show on Earth can say that. The evidence is sitting in the archives. When Barack Obama won the 2008 presidential election, South Park aired an episode about it less than 24 hours later. That episode used actual audio from Obama's victory speech. Think about what that means. While every other animated show was still somewhere in the middle of its months-long production cycle, South Park had already written a script, recorded the voices, animated the whole thing, and broadcast it to millions of people before most of the country had even finished talking about election night. 3 years earlier, there was an even sharper example. In December 2003, American soldiers found Saddam Hussein hiding in an underground hiding spot in Iraq. This was one of the biggest news stories of the year. A South Park episode referencing that capture aired 3 days after it happened. 3 days! The Simpsons was still 8 months away from even starting production on whatever they were going to say about it. And before that, in the year 2000, there was an episode about the Elian Gonzalez situation, a story about a young boy caught in a legal and political fight between Cuba and the United States that had taken over the news. The South Park episode episode about it referenced a government raid that had happened just 4 days before the episode aired. 4 days from real-world event to finished broadcast television episode. This is not a record any other animated show has ever come close to matching. Not The Simpsons, not Family Guy, not Futurama, not any of them. Now think about what this means for how those other shows handle the world. The Simpsons, at its best, was sharp. It was pointed. It had observations about American life that still feel true decades later. But by the time a Simpsons episode about a political scandal reaches your screen, that scandal has already gone through the full cycle. The initial story, the hot takes, the backlash, the counter backlash, the think pieces, the late night jokes, the cultural burial, and the first wave of nostalgia. The Simpsons is always commenting on history. South Park is commenting on what happened this week. That gap is not small. It is the difference between reading an editorial about something that happened yesterday and reading a history book about something that happened 10 years ago. Both can be smart. Only one feels alive. Family Guy operates in roughly the same slow production world as The Simpsons. The cutaway gags that define Family Guy's style are often references to movies, celebrities, and cultural moments. But those references can feel dated and yellowed by the time they air because of how long the production cycle takes. A Family Guy joke about a show that was popular 18 months ago is an old joke. A South Park joke about something that happened 4 days ago is still a fresh wound. This is not just about speed for its own sake. Speed changes what you can say and how you can say it. A slow-moving show has to deal in timeless observations because it cannot afford to be topical. It has to write jokes that will still make sense 9 months from now. That forces a kind of abstraction. South Park, because it moves so fast, can be specific. It can name names. It can describe events precisely. It can mock the exact shape of a cultural moment while that moment is still happening, before anyone has had time to build a comfortable story around it. This is also why South Park's humor hits differently than its competitors. There is a rawness to it that comes directly from the speed. The show has not had time to sand down its edges. The writers have not spent 6 months talking themselves out of their first instinct. The first instinct is what goes to air. Sometimes that first instinct is wrong. Sometimes it is clumsy. But when it is right, and it is right more often than any show running on this kind of schedule has any right to be, it feels like watching someone say the thing out loud that everyone was already thinking but hadn't figured out how to say yet. The only time in the show's entire history that South Park missed its own deadline was in 2013. A power outage hit the production studio the night before an episode was supposed to air. That was it. One power outage in over 25 years of weekly production. The episode, which was called Goth Kids 3: Dawn of the Posers, was rescheduled to air a week later. Parker and Stone treated it like a personal failure. One power outage. That is the only time the machine broke down. Compare that to the production histories of competing shows. The Simpsons regularly takes full seasons off. Family Guy was canceled twice and went years between new episodes. Futurama was canceled, came back, and was canceled again. Rick and Morty has had gaps between seasons of 2, 3, and 4 years. South Park has been producing new episodes every single year since 1997, rarely missing a beat, running on a schedule that would destroy most television writers before they got to their 3rd season. The physical setup that makes this possible is worth understanding. Almost every part of making a South Park episode happens in one building. The writers, animators, voice actors, editors, and sound team all work in the same space. There is no sending scripts overseas and waiting. There is no coordinating between time zones. Parker does most of the writing, directing, and voice work himself. Stone handles coordination and the business side of things. The whole operation is designed to eliminate any step that creates distance between an idea and a finished product. When Parker says something in the writer's room on a Thursday, that thing can be in your living room by Wednesday night. No other animated show in the world can say that. No live action show can say that either, unless it is a news program. What South Park built is not just a fast cartoon. It is the only animated show in history that operates on the speed of a news organization with the creative freedom of a cable comedy. That combination has never existed anywhere else. It exists here because two people decided that the only way to make the show they wanted to make was to stop giving themselves time to talk themselves out of it. Every other cartoon in the history of animation has more time than South Park. More time to write, more time to animate, more time to polish, more time to make something look expensive and finished. South Park takes that time advantage and buries it. That is what the machine does. And the machine, it turns out, is only the beginning of what makes this show different from everything else. __quote_0___. Because being fast only matters if you have something worth saying. And South Park's opinion on what is worth saying, what topics, what targets, what beliefs are fair game, them and which ones are too dangerous to touch is a whole different argument, which is exactly where we are going next. Section 2. The thesis written in construction paper. Why crude animation was always the point. There is a version of South Park that never gets made. It is smoother. The characters look rounder and more detailed. The backgrounds have shading and depth. The movements flow instead of jerk. It looks like a real cartoon made by real professionals who care about how things look. That version of South Park would have been a worse show. Not a little worse. Fundamentally, structurally, philosophically worse. Because the crude animation that millions of people have spent nearly 30 years laughing at, cringing at, and occasionally being embarrassed to admit they watch, is not a flaw in the design of South Park. It is the design of South Park. The cheapness is the point. The ugliness is the argument. To understand why, you have to go back to where the look came from. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were film students at the University of Colorado in the early 1990s. They made a short animated film using actual construction paper. They cut out little paper shapes and moved them around and photographed each position one frame at a time. The technique was old, simple, and slow in the way that stop-motion animation is slow, but what came out of it had a quality that neither of them had planned on. It looked like something a kid had made. Not a bad kid, not a careless kid, but a kid. The paper had texture. The movements were slightly wrong. The whole thing had the feel of something that existed in the real world rather than on a drawing board. Parker and Stone had been lifelong fans of Monty Python's Flying Circus, the British comedy show. Monty Python had a member named Terry Gilliam, who made animated segments for the show using a very similar technique. Cutout pieces, simple shapes, jerky movements, a deliberately rough quality that was part of the joke. Parker and Stone grew up watching those animations and absorbing the idea that animation did not have to be Disney to be powerful. It did not have to be smooth to be funny. In fact, sometimes the roughness was funnier than polish ever could be. When they made the short film that eventually became South Park, they were not cutting corners. They were making a choice. The construction paper look was the look they wanted. It said something. It communicated, before a single joke landed, that this was not a children's cartoon trying to look like a children's cartoon. It was something else. Something made quickly and bluntly and without much interest in impressing anyone with craft. When the show moved to computer animation after the pilot, the team worked specifically to keep the same rough quality. The characters are made of simple flat shapes in basic colors. Most of the child characters are the same size and shape, told apart only by their clothes and hats and hair. Almost everything is presented flat, from one angle, like a drawing in a book rather than a scene in a film. The decision to keep this look while using software that could have made the show look far more detailed was not laziness. It was a commitment to what the show was supposed to feel like. Here is what that feeling communicates. When you watch a show with expensive, detailed animation, you are being told something before anyone speaks. You are being told that this matters, that someone spent serious time and money making this look impressive, that you are watching something that takes itself seriously as a visual experience. Disney movies operate this way. Pixar movies operate this way. Even a show like Futurama, which ran during much of the same era as South Park, put serious effort into creating a visual world that felt built and detailed and worth looking at. South Park walks in and says none of that matters. The flat little paper children in their flat little Colorado town are not asking to be taken seriously as a visual achievement. They are not asking for your respect on those terms. What they are asking for is your attention to what they are actually saying. The look is a direct instruction to the viewer. Do not get distracted by how this looks, because how this looks is irrelevant. Listen to what is being said. This is not a small thing. It is a full philosophy of what animation is for. The shows that spent their budgets on beautiful animation were making a bet. They were betting that viewers would stay engaged, partly because the thing looked good. The colors and movement and detail would carry some of the weight of keeping people watching. South Park refused that bet entirely. There is nothing in the visual presentation of South Park designed to make you want to keep watching because it looks interesting. Every single viewer who keeps watching South Park is keeping watching because of the writing, because of the ideas, because of what is being said. The visual style eliminates every other reason to stay. This makes South Park one of the purest tests of writing quality in the history of television. A show with beautiful animation can coast on how it looks during its weaker episodes. South Park cannot coast on anything. If the writing is weak, there is nothing else to carry the episode. The crude look is a form of honesty about what the show actually is. Now think about what that look does to the humor specifically. There is a particular kind of joke that only works in South Park and nowhere else. It is the joke where something horrifying or disturbing disturbing, or deeply wrong is presented with exactly the same visual energy as everything else in the episode. A character dies, a child says something terrible, something unspeakable happens in the background, and the show just keeps moving in the same flat, cheerful, slightly wrong visual style it always uses. No dramatic music, no lingering close-up, no special visual treatment to signal that what just happened was significant. This creates a type of comedy that is genuinely unique. When something awful happens in a show with detailed, realistic animation, the look of the show amplifies the awfulness. You feel the weight of it because the visuals are communicating something about how you are supposed to feel. South Park takes that signal away. When Kenny dies, which happened regularly across the early seasons, his death is rendered in the same crude, simple, slightly absurd visual language as everything else in the episode. The lack of visual weight is itself the joke. The show is communicating through its aesthetic that it does not plan to tell you how to feel. You figure it out. This is the opposite of what most animated shows do. Most animation, even adult animation, uses its visual style to guide your emotional response. Fast cuts and dramatic music tell you when to be excited. Slow, warm lighting tells you when to feel something tender. South Park strips all of that out and leaves you in a flat, evenly lit, deliberately awkward visual world where nothing is being emotionally underlined. You are on your own. The genius of this is that it actually makes the rare moments of genuine emotion hit harder, because the show has spent hours across many episodes refusing to underline anything, refusing to use its visuals to manipulate your feelings. When something genuinely lands, when a scene earns a real emotional response without any visual support, it lands with a weight that a more polished show could never achieve. You feel it more because the show never tried to make you feel it. It just happened. Compare this to a show like Family Guy, which uses its relatively smooth animation and its musical choices to constantly signal how you are supposed to respond to what you are watching. The cutaway gag gets a comic sting sound. The sentimental moment gets soft piano. The action sequence gets dramatic scoring. Family Guy is always telling you what lane to be in emotionally. South Park does not do this. The crude animation is part of the mechanism by which South Park refuses to manage your responses for you. Now look at the practical advantage this created that nobody talks about enough. Because South Park does not rely on beautiful animation, it can animate anything, any setting, any character, any visual concept. Any celebrity, politician, or cultural figure can be dropped into South Park as a simple flat shape in about the time it takes to cut out a paper doll. The show can place its characters on the moon, in the middle of ancient Rome, inside a human body, or inside a video game with equal visual effort. Nothing is harder to draw than anything else because the style is already so simple that complexity is never the issue. This is directly connected to the speed discussed in the previous section. The animation style is not just a philosophy, it is an infrastructure. The simplicity of the look enables the speed of the production. You cannot make an episode of The Simpsons in 6 days, partly because the level of animation detail required to meet that show's visual standard takes months of work by dozens of trained animators. South Park's visual standard can be met in days by a much smaller team because the standard itself was deliberately set at a level that makes speed possible. The crude look and the fast production are not two separate decisions. They are the same decision, made at the beginning, that defines everything the show is able to do. There is also something worth saying about what the look communicates to authority. Television animation, especially in the late 1990s when South Park launched, operated within a fairly clear set of signals about what was acceptable and what was not. Shows that looked polished and expensive were being produced by responsible, professional organizations that understood the rules. Shows that looked cheap and rough were being made by people who maybe did not care that much about the rules. South Park looked like the latter. The crude animation was a signal, whether intentional or not, that the people making this were not particularly interested in being told what was appropriate. The look itself is a kind of small defiance. It says that the show is not going to perform responsibility through its aesthetics. It is going to do what it wants to do and let the content speak for itself. In the years since South Park launched, plenty of animated shows have tried to copy elements of what it does. They have tried to be edgier, faster, more topical, more willing to offend. Almost none of them have tried to copy the visual philosophy, because the visual philosophy looks like a weakness. It looks like a limitation. It looks like Parker and Stone just did not have the resources to make something better looking. But the visual philosophy is not a weakness. It is the armor. It is the thing that keeps South Park honest about what it is, forces its writing to carry all the weight, and communicates to anyone watching that they are not here to be impressed by craft, they are here to be confronted by ideas. Every smooth, beautiful, expensive animated show that came before and after South Park made a different bet. They bet that looking good was worth the investment. They bet that their audiences would respond to visual quality as part of the package. South Park made one paper cutout, kept the aesthetic for 30 years, and built one of the most financially valuable and culturally influential franchises in the history of television animation. The construction paper won, and the construction paper, as it turns out, was never really about how the show looked. It was about what the show was willing to say. Because when you strip away every visual excuse and every aesthetic distraction, when you put your argument in the crudest possible package, what you are left with is just the argument itself. Naked and unapologetic. South Park has always known exactly what it wants to argue. Quote _1_, though whether that argument is as neutral and fair as Parker and Stone have always claimed, that is where the real debate begins. Because the show does have a worldview. It is just hiding behind the Equal Opportunity Offense Act, and once you see it, every episode looks a little different. That is what we are going to take apart next. Section 3. The ideology nobody will name. What South Park actually believes. Parker and Stone have a line they have used in interviews for nearly 30 years. They say the show mocks everyone equally. They say they do not have a side. They say if you think South Park agrees with you politically, you have misread the show. They present themselves as two guys standing outside of every belief system, throwing rocks at all of them with equal force and equal contempt. This is one of the most effective pieces of self-mythology in the history of American television. It is not entirely wrong. South Park does mock everyone. It mocks conservatives and liberals. It mocks religious people and atheists. It mocks activists and apathetic people. It mocks the left for being preachy and the right for being cruel. There are episodes that seem to attack positions from every possible direction, and Parker and Stone have never been shy about saying they find both major political parties embarrassing. But mocking everyone equally is not the same as having no beliefs, and South Park absolutely has beliefs. It has a consistent, identifiable set of values that runs through almost every episode if you know what you are looking for. The show just disguises those values behind the Equal Opportunity Offense Act because the disguise is smarter than announcing them outright. Here is what South Park actually believes. It believes that individual freedom matters more than group identity. It believes that institutions, governments, corporations, religions, movements, are almost always corrupt or stupid or both. It believes that people who are loudly certain about their moral positions are more dangerous than people who are uncertain. It believes that earnestness, meaning sincere and unironic belief in things, is embarrassing. And it believes that the smartest response to a broken world is to see through everything rather than to try to fix anything. That is a specific worldview. It is not neutral. It is not both sides. It has a name in political philosophy, which is broadly libertarian, and it leans in a direction that tends to be more comfortable for people on the right than on the left, even if it occasionally attacks the right just as viciously. The evidence is in how the show treats its targets differently. When South Park attacks a conservative position, it usually attacks it by showing it as dumb or mean or hypocritical. When South Park attacks a liberal position, it usually attacks it by showing it as naive, self-righteous, or annoying. These are not equal attacks. Being shown as dumb and mean is devastating. Being shown as too idealistic and a little annoying is almost flattering by comparison. Think about how the show has handled environmental issues across its run. There is a famous episode called Smug Alert from season 10, which aired in 2006. The episode is about hybrid car owners who become so self-congratulatory about their environmental choices that they create a cloud of smug over the city of San Francisco. The targets of the joke are liberal, environmentally conscious people who feel superior about their beliefs. The episode is extremely funny. It is also making a very specific argument that caring about the environment is mostly a personality type for people who want to feel better than others, rather than a genuine response to a genuine problem. The episode does not spend equal time examining whether the thing those people are worried about, environmental damage, is a real concern worth taking seriously. It is entirely focused on mocking the emotional style of the people who care. This is the show's pattern with liberal causes repeatedly across its run. The cause is treated as an excuse excuse for the personality rather than a response to a real situation. Now think about the Kyle function, which the SOP describes as essential to understanding the show's actual positions. Kyle is the moral voice of South Park. He is the character who objects when something seems wrong. He is the one who argues for fairness and decency and the idea that some things actually matter. And Parker and Stone consistently put Kyle in the position of being either the last person to figure something out, or the person whose moral certainty causes more problems than it solves, or the person who makes an impassioned speech about right and wrong and then gets ignored or humiliated. When Kyle wins an argument on South Park, the show is agreeing with him. When Kyle loses or looks foolish, or when his position gets demolished by the plot, the show is making its most honest and revealing statements about what it actually thinks. Kyle is Jewish. He cares about fairness. He believes things can get better. He speaks up when he thinks something is wrong. He is, in the show's universe, the representative of a specific type of liberal, conscience-driven, moral engagement with the world. And the show spends an enormous amount of time making him look naive. Meanwhile, the character of Cartman, who represents the opposite of everything Kyle stands for, is the most electrically alive presence in the show. Cartman is selfish, bigoted, manipulative, and completely without guilt. He is also frequently right about how things actually work. Not morally right, practically right. He understands what motivates people better than Kyle does. He reads situations more accurately. He wins more often. The show never endorses Cartman morally, but it keeps demonstrating that his view of human nature, cynical, self-interested, stripped of illusion, is more accurate than Kyle's optimistic version. This is not accidental. Parker and Stone built this dynamic deliberately. It tells you something very specific about what the show believes regarding human nature and the value of moral idealism. Now look at how the show handled what might be its most important political moments. In 2015 and 2016, South Park spent 2 full seasons building an elaborate storyline around the American presidential election. The show set up a race between a giant douche and a turd sandwich, a metaphor Parker and Stone had used years earlier to describe the choice between 2 bad political options. The season was constructed around the expectation that a specific candidate would win, and the writers publicly admitted that they had written episodes assuming a particular outcome. When the actual election produced a different outcome than expected, Parker and Stone had to rewrite the finale in real time. What came out was an episode that framed the unexpected result as the fault of the other side's smugness and certainty. The people who were shocked by the result were shown as having brought it on themselves through their own arrogance and condescension. This framing, that political outcomes you find disturbing are primarily the fault of people who were too loud and certain about their values, is a very specific political argument dressed up as equal opportunity mockery. It is not neutral. It takes a side. The side it takes is the side that finds moral certainty more annoying than the things that moral certainty is responding to. Writers and critics noticed this pattern. A writer named Dana Schwartz wrote publicly that South Park taught a generation of young people, particularly young men, that earnestness was the worst sin and that mockery was the smartest response to everything. She argued that the show made ironic detachment feel like intelligence and sincere belief feel like weakness. Parker and Stone pushed back on this characterization, as they always do, but the pattern in the actual episodes is harder to push back on. The show has more contempt for people who care too loudly than for almost any other type of person. Politicians who abuse their power get mocked, but activists who fight back against that power get mocked just as hard, sometimes harder, for the crime of taking it too seriously. This double standard reveals something. You can mock the players on every side of a game, but if you reserve your sharpest contempt for the referees who are trying to enforce the rules, you are not neutral. You are picking a side. The side that prefers the game to continue without interference. There is also the question of what South Park leaves out, which is as revealing as what it puts in. The show is very good at identifying the hypocrisy and stupidity within movements that push for social change. It is much less interested in examining the underlying conditions that produce those movements. An episode about political correctness gone too far will spend 22 minutes on the absurdity of the response and almost no time on the thing being responded to. An episode about race will examine the messiness of how people talk about race far more carefully than it examines the actual conditions that make race a live issue in the first place. This is a choice. It is not the only possible approach to satire. The Simpsons at its best managed to mock the system and maintain genuine sympathy for the people at the bottom of it simultaneously. South Park usually picks one over the other, and it almost always picks mocking the system's critics over examining the system itself. Does this make South Park a right-wing show? No, that is too simple. Parker and Stone have gone after corporations, military contractors, religious institutions, and conservative politicians with genuine ferocity. The show has no loyalty loyalty to any political team. But having no loyalty to a political team is not the same as having no ideology. The ideology is in the values. The values are consistently skeptical of organized effort, suspicious of collective belief, hostile to earnestness, and more entertained by cynicism than by hope. These are values. They have consequences. They shaped how a generation of viewers, particularly the young men who made up the core South Park audience in the late 1990s and early 2000s, thought about politics and society and the question of whether it was worth caring about anything at all. The show that told you mockery was the highest form of intelligence also told you, by implication, that sincere engagement was the lowest. That believing in things was for people who had not thought hard enough. That the smartest position was always the one that could see through everyone else's positions without committing to one of its own. This is a message. It is powerful, and it went out for 30 years wearing the costume of not being a message at all. To be clear, none of this makes South Park dishonest or bad. A show can have a worldview and still be brilliant. The Simpsons had a worldview. Futurama had a worldview. Every long-running show that says anything meaningful about the world has one. The problem is not that South Park has a worldview. The problem is the specific claim that it does not, because that claim is itself part of the worldview. The idea that smart people do not take sides, that seeing through everything is more valuable than believing in anything. The most revealing episodes are not the ones where the show attacks a clearly bad target. Any show can attack clearly bad targets. The revealing episodes are the ones where the show attacks people who are trying to do something right and failing imperfectly. Those are the episodes where you see what the show actually finds most threatening. Not cruelty, not corruption, not stupidity, trying and getting it wrong while caring about it. That is the unforgivable sin in South Park's universe. And once you see it, the whole run of the show looks slightly different, more consistent, more argued, more honest about what it is, in a way that its own creators would probably resist admitting. Parker and Stone have built something genuinely great, but great things have points of view, and it is time more people named this one out loud. Because the next question is, what happens when all of that ideology, all of that worldview, all of that built-up cynicism dressed as neutrality gets handed to a single character, one 8-year-old boy in a red jacket and a blue hat who carries all of it without ever having to pretend he is neutral about anything. __quote _2 __. What South Park did with that character changed what animated television was capable of producing permanently. Section 4, quote 3. The episode that changed what animation could do to a character. There is a before and an after in South Park. Not a before and after in terms of the show getting better or worse, though plenty of people argue about that. A before and after in terms of what kind of show South Park actually was, what it was capable of, what it was willing to do, where the line was, and whether there even was a line. The before lasted 4 seasons. The after has lasted over 20. The moment that separates them is a single episode. Season 5, Episode 4. It aired on July 11th, 2001. It is called Scott Tenorman Must Die. It has a 9.6 rating on IMDb, which makes it one of the highest rated individual television episodes in the history of the website. Critics from Vulture, the AV Club, Rolling Stone, Time, Variety, and The Ringer have all placed it on their list of the best television episodes ever made. Not the best South Park episodes, the best television episodes. Full stop. None of that was predictable going in. It looked from the outside like a straightforward revenge episode. A kid gets tricked into buying something embarrassing. He wants his money back. The person who tricked him refuses. A conflict begins. This is a sitcom setup that has existed since the beginning of sitcoms. Nothing about the premise suggested what was coming. What was coming was the moment Eric Cartman stopped being a spoiled, loud, unpleasant kid and became something else entirely. Something that had no real equivalent anywhere in animated television before it. Here is what happens in the episode. A 9th grader named Scott Tenorman tricks Cartman into buying his pubic hair for $10 by convincing him this is how you reach puberty. When Cartman figures out he has been tricked, he goes to Scott and asks for his money back. Scott refuses. Cartman tries several different plans to get the money back or get revenge on Scott. Scott outsmarts him every time. Scott humiliates Cartman publicly. He forces Cartman to dance and beg for the money, then burns it right in front of him. He makes a video of Cartman humiliating himself and shows it to the whole town. Kenny literally dies from laughing at the video. By this point in the episode, Cartman has been shown to be completely outmatched. Scott is older, smarter, and more cruel. The audience is watching Cartman get destroyed, repeatedly and completely, by someone better at this than he is. If you watch the first 4 seasons of South Park, you have a clear idea of what kind of show this is and roughly where this episode is going. Cartman will probably do something gross gross or stupid or funny in his final revenge attempt. It will probably backfire. The episode will end with him losing or with some kind of absurd resolution that does not fully satisfy anyone. That is not what happens. What Cartman actually does is spend weeks executing a plan of such cold, precise, and genuinely disturbing intelligence that it reframes everything you thought you knew about the character. He figures out that Scott loves the band Radiohead. He writes letters to Radiohead pretending to be Scott, claiming that Scott has cancer in a personal area and is dying, and asking if the band can come visit him. Radiohead agrees. He arranges for Scott's parents to come to a chili festival. He engineers a situation where Scott's parents are shot and killed by a local farmer who believes they are trespassing on his property. He takes the bodies, he grinds them up and puts them in chili. He serves the chili to Scott at the festival, watching Scott eat it happily. Then at the exact moment Radiohead arrives to see Scott, Cartman reveals what Scott has just eaten. Scott's favorite band watches him have a complete breakdown upon learning he has consumed his own parents. Cartman licks Scott's tears, calls them yummy. The episode ends. Parker and Stone have talked about this episode many times over the years. They debated whether to go through with the central plot. They worried it was too far. They found it important that Cartman did not directly pull any trigger himself. He manipulated events so that other people and accidents did the actual killing, which felt slightly different to them than having Cartman commit murder with his own hands. After long debate, they went ahead with it. The decision changed the show permanently in two directions at once. The first direction was character. Trey Parker said directly in interviews that this was the episode where Cartman became, in their words, the most evil kid in the world. Before this episode, Cartman was mean and selfish and funny. After this episode, Cartman was something that had never existed in animation before. A child character with genuine, terrifying, long-term strategic evil. Not cartoon evil, not mustache-twirling villain evil. Actual, patient, calculating evil that could hold a plan together over weeks and execute it with precision. This distinction matters enormously. There had been villains in animated shows before South Park. There had been antagonists, bullies, bad guys of various kinds. But animated characters, even adult animated characters, had never been allowed to be evil in this specific way. Evil that is intelligent. Evil that plans. Evil that waits. Evil that wins completely and then savors it. Cartman winning at the end of Scott Tenorman Must Die is not played as a joke. It is not undercut. The show does not punish him or correct him or restore order at the end. Scott is destroyed. Cartman drinks his tears. Radiohead calls Scott a crybaby. The credits roll. The character who committed something genuinely terrible has gotten exactly what he wanted and faced zero consequences. No animated show had ever done this. Not in the way South Park did it here. The second direction was structural. Parker has explained that this was the first South Park episode with only one storyline. Before this, every episode had at least two plots running simultaneously. An A story and usually a B story or C story that ran alongside it. This was standard television writing structure at the time, especially for animated comedies. You had your main plot and your backup plot running parallel, cutting between them to vary the pace and give the episode breathing room. Scott Tenorman Must Die had no backup plot. It was just Cartman and Scott, start to finish, one story, one escalation, one ending. Parker said he and the team were terrified of this going in. They thought the episode would feel thin or slow without a second story to cut away to. What they discovered was the opposite. The single focus made the episode feel more urgent and more compelling than almost anything they had made before. The audience stayed locked in because there was nowhere else to go. The story had nowhere to hide. From that point on, many South Park episodes were structured the same way. One story, strong enough to carry the whole episode by itself. This seems like a simple lesson, but it changed the rhythm and feel of the show in ways that are still visible 20 years later. It made South Park episodes feel more like short films than like episodes of a television comedy, which is part of why the best ones have held up so well. Now, there is a layer to this episode that did not become clear until 9 seasons later, in 2010, during the episode called 201. In that later episode, it is revealed that Scott Tenorman's father, Jack Tenorman, was actually Cartman's biological father. This means that in Scott Tenorman Must Die, Cartman engineered the murder of his own father and fed him to his own half-brother. He did this without knowing it. The show used a detail from season 5 and gave it a completely different meaning 9 years later, which retroactively made one of the most disturbing things in the episode even more disturbing. This is a level of long-term storytelling and internal consistency that most animated shows do not even attempt. The idea that a joke from 2001 would have a new layer added to it in 2010 that fundamentally changed what it meant, that is not an an accident. That is a show that takes its own history seriously, that treats its characters as having real and consistent backstories that can be returned to and built upon. The fact that Cartman killed his own father and has spent subsequent seasons being someone with no father figure in his life takes on a specific sadness when you hold both pieces of information at once. The show never makes this sentimental. It never stops to acknowledge the tragedy of it directly, but it is there, underneath the cruelty and the comedy, if you are paying attention. Rolling Stone, in their ranking of the best South Park moments, put the reveal in Scott Tenorman Must Die at number 2 on the list. They called it the perfect mixture of the show being shocking and brilliant at the same time. That is the right description, but it undersells what the episode actually accomplished. It was not just a shocking, brilliant moment, it was a proof of concept. It proved that animation could go to places in character writing that almost no other format was willing to go. It proved that a cartoon could have a villain protagonist whose evil was real, whose plans were intelligent, and whose victories were allowed to stand without being corrected by the end of the episode. Every show that has since created a complex animated anti-hero, every adult animated series with a morally compromised central character who is funny and terrible simultaneously, owes something to what South Park figured out in this episode. The idea that an animated character could be genuinely bad and the show would not apologize for them, would not correct them at the end, would let them win and let you sit with how you feel about that. This was not standard practice before Scott Tenorman Must Die. It is also worth saying what this episode did to the audience relationship with Cartman specifically. After this episode, watching Cartman in any situation carries a different kind of tension. Before it, Cartman was a character you could laugh at comfortably. He was loud and unpleasant, but ultimately a buffoon who usually failed and got embarrassed. After it, watching Cartman get angry at someone or start planning something creates a low level of genuine unease, because you know now, you have seen what he is capable of when he decides someone has gone far enough. You have seen him patient, you have seen him smart, you have seen him lick another child's tears after engineering the death of that child's parents. That is not a comedic buffoon anymore. That is something else. Something that makes you laugh, but also makes you slightly uncomfortable with how much you are laughing. This tension between finding Cartman entertaining and recognizing that what he represents is genuinely dark is one of the things that makes South Park different from any other animated show. You are never fully at ease watching him. The show earned that unease in this episode and has maintained it ever since. Trey Parker and Matt Stone chose this episode as one of their personal favorites multiple times. In multiple interviews across multiple years, they have called it a milestone, they have called it a turning point. They are not wrong. But there is a second part to the Cartman story that Scott Tenorman Must Die only sets up. The episode establishes that Cartman can be evil. The next 20 seasons of the show explore what evil, that complex, that contradictory, and that specifically constructed actually means when you put it under a microscope. __quote _for__. Because Cartman is not just a villain. He is the most fully realized character in the history of American animation. And that argument requires its own section, which is exactly where we are going. Section 5. Cartman as the most complex character in the history of American animation. Start with a simple question. Name an animated character who is all of the following things at the same time. A main character who is also the show's primary villain. A person whose cruelty is real and whose victories are allowed to stand. Someone who makes you laugh harder than almost any character in television history, while also making you genuinely uncomfortable with how much you are laughing. A character who has committed acts that would be unforgivable in any other show, yet keeps getting invited back to the center of the story. Someone who occasionally, rarely, and unexpectedly does something that looks almost like kindness, and whose moments of vulnerability hit harder precisely because they are so rare. You cannot name one. Not from The Simpsons, not from Family Guy, not from Futurama, not from Rick and Morty, not from any animated show that has ever aired in America. The answer is Eric Cartman. And the fact that no other animated character comes close is not a coincidence. It is the result of specific, deliberate, sustained creative choices made over 27 years that no other show was willing or able to make. To understand what makes Cartman genuinely different from every other animated character, you have to start with what other shows do with their central characters, and why those choices, however successful, are fundamentally more limited. Homer Simpson is a bad father and husband in ways that would be catastrophic in real life. He is selfish, lazy, and often actively harmful to the people around him. But The Simpsons is built on a model where the emotional reality of Homer's failures is softened by the show's tone and by the reset button at the end of every episode. Homer does something terrible. The episode ends. Next week, the family is fine. The relationships are intact. The show needs Homer to be lovable underneath everything else, and that need puts a ceiling on how dark his character can actually go. Homer is a buffoon with a heart of gold, and the heart of gold is always visible somewhere, even on his worst days. Peter Griffin operates similarly. He is more cruel than Homer in some ways, more detached from consequences, more willing to hurt the people around him for trivial reasons. But Family Guy surrounds Peter with a comedic framework that consistently signals to the audience how to feel. When Peter does something terrible, the show uses its own comedic style to cushion the impact. The cutaway gags, the comic sound effects, the rhythm of the show all say, "This is just comedy, you can laugh safely, nothing here is real in the way that would actually disturb you." South Park does not do this for Cartman. It does not cushion him. It does not maintain a stable emotional baseline around him that tells you how to feel. And it does not use a reset button in the same way those other shows do. When Cartman does something genuinely terrible in South Park, the show lets that terrible thing have real weight within the world of the show. Other characters remember it. It has consequences that carry forward. The darkness accumulates rather than evaporating at the end of the episode. This accumulation is the key to understanding what makes Cartman unique. Parker and Stone have said directly that Cartman is their favorite character. They have talked about how he started as a simpler, louder, more cartoonish version of a bad kid in the early seasons, and evolved into something far more complicated as the show went on. The turning point, as established in the previous section, was Scott Tenorman Must Die in season 5. After that episode, Cartman was no longer a bratty child who made bad decisions. He was a strategist, someone who could plan across weeks, someone who could suppress his immediate reactions in service of a longer game. This evolution is documented across the show's run in ways that other animated characters simply do not have. Cartman in season 1 is recognizably the same character as Cartman in season 20, but he has changed. He has gotten smarter, darker, and more capable. His voice has changed, his relationships with the other boys have changed, the things he is willing to do have expanded into territory that would have seemed impossible for a children's cartoon character in the show's early years. And yet he is still technically a child, an 8 to 10-year-old boy in a Colorado mountain town. This gap between what Cartman is and what the show frames him as is one of the most sustained and sophisticated jokes in the history of animation. The show never stops presenting him within the visual and narrative framework of a children's cartoon about kids doing kid things, while simultaneously letting him do things that would be genuinely monstrous in any realistic context. Consider what Cartman has actually done across the show's run, taken as a complete body of work. He manipulated and orchestrated a situation that resulted in a classmate's parents being killed and served as food to that classmate. He pretended to have a terminal illness to get a Sony PSP. He dressed up as Adolf Hitler for Halloween in first grade. He started a white supremacist group by convincing other children that having red hair made them inferior. He faked being mentally impaired to compete in the Special Olympics for the cash prize. He put a small device in a boy's ear and controlled what that boy said using a remote, destroying the boy's relationships over several weeks. He convinced a classmate to consume what he claimed was a famous person's personal parts, served as food. He locked a character in a room underground for weeks. He manipulated an entire town into nearly destroying each other through a series of lies he constructed and maintained simultaneously. These are not jokes with asterisks. These are things that happened in the show, were treated as real within the show's logic, and had consequences that carried forward into later episodes. The show did not pull back from any of them. It let Cartman do all of it and kept him at the center of the story. No other animated show in America has let a main character do a fraction of this and stayed in production. The reason South Park gets away with it, and the reason it works artistically rather than just being offensive, is that Cartman is not presented as someone to admire or imitate. He is presented as a mirror. His behavior is so extreme and so precisely calibrated to reflect real human tendencies: selfishness, cruelty, bigotry, the need to dominate, the refusal to accept responsibility, that watching him is like looking at those tendencies through a magnifying glass. The exaggeration is the point. Cartman does what a lot of people feel like doing, taken to the most extreme possible conclusion, with none of the internal breaks that most people have and that Cartman completely lacks. Parker and Stone have said that the character of Cartman was partly inspired by Archie Bunker from the 1970s television show All in the Family. Archie Bunker was a bigoted, loud, self-righteous man whose prejudices were presented presented in a way that both made him funny and kept the audience aware that his worldview was wrong. Cartman carries that DNA, but pushes it far beyond what Archie Bunker ever did. Because South Park is not operating under the same limitations that a network television show in the 1970s was operating under. There is also the question of Cartman's moments of something approaching genuine feeling, which are rare but important. In an episode called Major Boobage from season 12, Cartman secretly hides cats in his attic to protect them from a town-wide ban, at real personal risk to himself. His concern for the cats appears to be genuine. He is not manipulating anyone. There is nothing to gain. He just cares about the cats. The episode treats this without making a big deal of it, which is exactly the right choice. If the show underlined it, it would break the character. By just letting it exist quietly, it adds a layer. In various other episodes, Cartman's relationship with his mother Leanne reveals something that the show never directly names. She spoils him completely and without limit. She never says no to him. She is, in the context of the show, the reason Cartman is the way he is. But she also genuinely loves him in a way that is real within the show's world. And Cartman, who treats almost everyone in his life as either a tool or an enemy, is different with her. Not transformed, not suddenly good, but different. Softer in small ways that the show lets you notice without pointing at them. These moments of something real inside the character are what make him more than a villain. A villain who is only a villain is a much simpler thing. Cartman is a villain with a recognizable interior life, with real relationships that matter to him even if he handles them terribly, with fears and insecurities that drive his behavior in ways the show gradually reveals across its run. The show has also done something even more ambitious with Cartman that most people do not fully register. It has let the same episode mean completely different things depending on which version of Cartman you are reading at any given moment. Because Cartman is sometimes the villain protagonist and sometimes the anti-hero, and sometimes briefly something almost like a regular character. He cycles between these positions depending on what the episode needs, and the cycling is not random. It follows a logic that is consistent with who the character has become across the full run of the show. Compare this to how other animated shows handle their morally complicated characters. Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty is brilliant and self-destructive and often cruel, but the show maintains a consistent emotional framework around him. You always know roughly how you are supposed to feel about Rick in any given moment. The show guides you. Cartman does not come with that guidance. The show does not tell you how to feel about him. It gives you the behavior and the consequences and then leaves you to figure out your own response. This requires more from the audience. It is a harder watch in some ways, but it produces a character relationship that is more honest and more complicated than what most shows are willing to create. Peter Griffin is funny. Homer Simpson is lovable. Rick Sanchez is tragic in a specific way the show makes clear. Cartman is all of those things and none of them, and something else that does not have a clean label. He is a 10-year-old boy who has done things that would make a movie villain look restrained. He is the most entertaining character in the show. He is the character that the show's own creators love most. He occasionally hides cats to protect them from harm. He once ate his own father without knowing it. He has never once apologized for anything in a way the show treats as sincere. He is, in the full sweep of what the show has built with him across 27 years, the most sustained and complex character achievement in the history of American animated television. No show has built anything like him. Not because other shows lacked the talent, but because other shows lacked the willingness to let a character be this dark, this funny, this consistent, and this genuinely unresolved for this long without ever blinking. South Park never blinked. And what South Park did with that same refusal to blink, when it turned it outward from its own characters toward the real world and real institutions, produced something even more remarkable than one complicated fictional boy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It produced the most consequential act of satire in the history of animated television, and it happened in a single episode against a single organization with a single caption on screen. That is where we are going next. Section 6, Trapped in the Closet, and how South Park destroyed an actual religion on primetime. Most television episodes disappear. They air, they get talked about for a few days, they get filed away in the archive of things that used to be relevant. The conversation moves on. The episode becomes a data point in a season overview. It shows up in a best of list years later. Someone quotes it at a party, and that is roughly the full scope of what a television episode does to the world. Then there are the rare ones, the ones that do not just reflect the world, but push back against it hard enough to leave a mark. The ones that make real institutions sweat. The ones that cost real people their jobs and produce real death threats and trigger real legal discussions. The ones where you can point to a moment in time before the episode aired and a moment after and say, with evidence, that the episode episode changed something. Trapped in the Closet is one of those episodes. Arguably the most consequential single episode any animated show has ever produced. Not because it was the funniest, not because it was the funniest, not because it was the most technically accomplished, but because of what it actually did to an actual organization with actual power in the real world. The episode aired on November 16th, 2005. It was the 12th episode of season 9. Here is what happens in it. Stan Marsh, one of the 4 main boys, takes a personality test at a Scientology center. The test comes back showing that Stan has an extraordinarily high score in a specific area that Scientologists measure. The Scientology leaders become convinced that Stan is the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology. They tell Stan this. They treat him with enormous reverence. Stan, being Stan, takes this seriously for a while, before eventually concluding that the whole organization is, in his words, a big global scam. While all of this is happening, the episode includes a sequence in which a Scientology leader sits Stan down and explains the foundational belief system of the organization. What follows is a detailed, accurate account of Scientology's core theology, specifically the story of a character named Xenu, a galactic ruler who, 75 million years ago, transported billions of people to Earth and destroyed them, with their spirits then attaching to living humans and causing psychological damage. The show runs a caption at the bottom of the screen throughout this entire sequence. The caption reads, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." That caption is the most important thing South Park has ever put on screen. 4 words. They did not mock the belief. They did not exaggerate it. They did not add anything to it. They just presented it accurately to a mainstream television audience and confirmed that they were not making it up. The reason this was so significant is that the specific information about Xenu was not widely known outside the Church of Scientology at the time. The church had actively worked to keep this theology secret from the general public and even from lower-level members. The belief system was only revealed to members who had reached a specific advanced level within the organization, which required years of participation and significant financial investment. Showing it to millions of television viewers without warning, presented plainly and confirmed as genuine, was a direct attack on the church's ability to control its own narrative. To make the episode, Parker and Stone worked with a journalist named Mark Ebner, who had previously written a best-selling book about Hollywood that included detailed research on Scientology and its influence in the entertainment industry. Ebner had joined the church himself for several weeks in order to research it from the inside. His knowledge of the actual belief system was accurate and detailed. The Comedy Central website stated after the episode aired that nothing in the Scientology sequence had been exaggerated. It was presented exactly as the church itself taught it to its members. The response from the Church of Scientology was swift and serious. On the day after the episode aired, a senior official within the church wrote a memo to the organization's leader describing what had happened. The memo described the episode as a complete mockery of the organization, its members, and its famous followers. The official noted that the episode had included upper-level information that the church considered private. The church began planning its response, which included discussions about potential legal action against Parker, Stone, and Comedy Central. They ultimately decided not to sue. Their legal team reportedly concluded that the case was too weak to win, partly because the information was already technically available to the public in various forms, and partly because suing would draw even more attention to the episode and the beliefs it had revealed. The strategy of ignoring it would likely have been smarter. The strategy they actually chose made things considerably worse. What the church did instead was attempt to use its connections in the entertainment industry to pressure Comedy Central into not re-airing the episode. This effort was documented in later reporting and confirmed by multiple former members of the church. The attempt failed, though it was not entirely without effect. For a period, the episode was pulled from the rerun schedule, which Parker and Stone publicly responded to with a statement that mocked the church in the same language the church used about itself. Meanwhile, the most visible immediate consequence was the departure of Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes had voiced the character of Chef since the very first episode of South Park in 1997. Chef was one of the most beloved characters in the show's history. He was the school cafeteria worker who gave the boys advice, often in the form of inappropriate songs. Hayes had been with the show for 8 full seasons and had participated in episodes that mocked Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, and almost every other belief system the show had ever touched. He had never publicly objected to any of it. In March 2006, roughly 4 months after Trapped in the Closet aired, a statement was released in Hayes' name announcing that he was leaving South Park. The statement said that there was a place for satire in the world, but that the show had crossed a line by disrespecting religious beliefs. Matt Stone responded publicly and directly. Stone pointed out that Hayes had been fine with the show mocking every other religion for 8 years. The only religion the show had now mocked that Hayes was a member of was Scientology. Stone said that Hayes was applying a different standard to his own religion than to every other religion the show had attacked, and that this was where intolerance actually began. Stone's response was widely covered and generally received as the more credible position. Later reporting suggested that Hayes may not have made the decision to leave entirely on his own. According to people who knew him, Hayes had suffered a stroke in January 2006, 2 months before the statement was released. Some people close to him suggested that the statement had been put out by people in his circle who had connections to the church, and that Hayes himself may not have been fully in a position to authorize it at the time. This account was never fully confirmed, but it was reported by multiple sources, including Fox News, which noted that Hayes had reportedly spoken positively about his working relationship with Parker and Stone after the episode aired before the stroke. Regardless of the circumstances of his departure, the show's response was immediate and unambiguous. The first episode of season 10 was called The Return of Chef. In it, Chef comes back to South Park after joining a group called the Super Adventure Club, a thinly disguised reference to the kind of organization that brainwashes its members. All of Chef's dialogue in the episode was assembled from recordings of Hayes in previous episodes, spliced together into new sentences. At the end of the episode, Chef dies in an extremely graphic and prolonged sequence, before being resurrected as a villain character called Darth Chef. The episode was Parker and Stone's response to the departure, and it was not subtle. The episode made the point clearly. The show would not soften its position, would not apologize, and would not treat any institution differently because that institution had powerful friends in the entertainment industry. There is a further layer to this episode's real-world impact that is specific, documented, and genuinely remarkable. Jenna Miscavige Hill is the niece of David Miscavige, the current leader of the Church of Scientology. She eventually left the church and became one of its most prominent and vocal former members, writing about her experiences and speaking publicly about the organization's practices. In interviews, she stated that she learned the story of Xenu, the foundational theology of Scientology that the church had worked to keep private, from watching Trapped in the Closet. She was a member of the church at the time, a member with family connections to its leadership, and she learned what her own organization believed about the origin of human existence not from the church itself, but from a South Park episode. That is not a metaphor. That is not an exaggeration. That is a documented account from a specific named person with direct connections to the organization being described. No other animated episode has ever produced anything like this. No other cartoon has ever had such a direct, documented, and specific effect on the internal dynamics of a real-world institution. The episode helped turn public opinion against the Church of Scientology at a time when the church was still maintaining a relatively smooth public image. It mainstreamed information that the church had spent enormous resources keeping contained. And it did all of this in 22 minutes, with crude, flat animation using the voice of a child character named Stan Marsh. The San Francisco Chronicle said Parker and Stone probably hit the highest point of their entire careers when they made this episode. TV Guide ranked it as the 17th best television episode ever made in their 2009 list. Not the 17th best animated episode, the 17th best episode out of every show in the history of the medium. The episode was nominated for an Emmy Award. It won the title of Favorite Episode of the Series from one of the show's own voice actresses, April Stewart. Parker and Stone have included it in multiple lists of their personal favorite episodes of the show they created. Every other animated show on television has, at some point or another, poked fun at religion. The Simpsons has done episodes about Catholicism, evangelical Christianity, and various cults. Family Guy has mocked organized religion in dozens of episodes. Rick and Morty occasionally touches on questions of meaning and the absence of any divine purpose. None of these shows have ever produced anything that came close to what Trapped in the Closet did. None of them forced a major organization to hold legal discussions about whether to sue. None of them caused a cast member to quit in a documented response to a specific episode. None of them were directly credited by a member of the targeted organization as the source of their first real knowledge of what their organization believed. South Park did not just make a funny episode about a religion. It did something no other cartoon has ever done. It used 22 minutes of television to genuinely damage the public standing of an organization with real power and real resources and a documented history of aggressively protecting its image. And when that organization pushed back, the show pushed harder. The story of how South Park handled that pushback, not just from Scientology, but from governments, networks, religious extremists, and its own parent company, is the story of something no other animated show in history has ever had to do or been willing to do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Staying on air when the people who want you off air are willing to use every tool available available to make that happen. That is where we go next. Section 7. The Free Speech War. How South Park fought censorship every other cartoon surrendered to. Most television shows, when they run into a wall, go around it. They find a softer angle. They pull the episode. They issue an apology. They adjust the joke to something that will not cause the same problem. They weigh the cost of the fight against the cost of the compromise, and almost always decide that the compromise is cheaper. This is not weakness necessarily. It is the rational calculation of an organization that has advertisers, a parent company, a network relationship, and a public image to maintain. Every television show operates within a web of pressures from above and below, and most shows respond to those pressures by bending when the pressure gets strong enough. South Park spent nearly 30 years doing the opposite, not always successfully, not without cost. There were battles it lost, episodes that got pulled, moments where the network drew a line that Parker and Stone could not cross. But what separates South Park from every other animated show in history is not that it won every fight. It is that it kept fighting when every rational calculation said to stop. And the record of those fights, taken together, is unlike anything else in the history of television animation. To understand the full scope of what South Park was up against, you have to understand the basic landscape of American television comedy in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Cable television was less restricted than network television, but it was not without limits. Comedy Central was a small network with limited resources and limited leverage against the pressure campaigns that organized groups could mount against it. The standard response to a controversy involving a television show was to pull the episode, issue a statement expressing regret for any offense caused, and move on quickly. This is what networks did. This is what was expected. South Park arrived and treated this entire system as an obstacle to be mocked rather than a set of rules to be respected. The show's philosophy on this question came directly from Parker and Stone themselves, and it was consistent from the beginning. They believed that satire only worked if it applied the same standards to every target. If you were willing to mock one religion, you had to be willing to mock all of them. If you were willing to portray one group in an unflattering way, you had to be willing to do it to every group. The moment you started carving out exceptions, this group gets mocked but not that one, this belief is fair game but not that one, you stopped being a satirist and started being something else. Something with a list of people it was afraid of. Parker and Stone were not interested in being afraid. The first major test of this philosophy came not with Scientology, but with the show's very first season, in an episode involving the character of Jesus Christ. South Park presented Jesus as a regular character who appeared in South Park and occasionally had to deal with situations from the modern world. The show treated him with a kind of cheerful irreverence that was deeply offensive to many Christian viewers. Letters were written, complaints were filed, the show kept going. This set a pattern. The show mocked Christianity repeatedly across its run. It mocked Judaism, which was built into the fabric of the show through the character of Kyle and his family. It mocked Mormonism in an episode that presented the founding story of the Mormon Church with cartoonish detail and ended with a Mormon character defending his faith in a way that was simultaneously funny and genuinely moving. It mocked Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and atheism. It presented Buddha snorting cocaine. It showed various religious figures behaving in ways that members of those faiths found deeply disrespectful. None of these episodes produced consequences as severe as what happened with the Muhammad episodes. And the story of those episodes is the clearest illustration of what South Park was actually fighting for and against. The first appearance of the Prophet Muhammad in South Park came in 2001, in an episode called Super Best Friends. In that episode, Muhammad appears as a member of a group of religious figures who work together as a team. He is portrayed positively and heroically. He is shown on screen without any special treatment. There was virtually no controversy at the time. The episode aired, was watched, and was filed away without incident. The reason there was no controversy in 2001 is that the specific cultural tension around visual depictions of Muhammad had not yet become the flashpoint it would later become. Following a series of events in Europe in the years after that episode aired, including the murder of a Dutch filmmaker by a religious extremist, and the violent international response to cartoons published in a Danish newspaper, depicting Muhammad visually became one of the most charged and dangerous things a media organization could do. Parker and Stone knew this when they decided to depict Muhammad again in 2010, in the episodes called 200 and 201, which were produced to mark the show's 200th episode. The plot of these episodes involved various celebrities and figures who had been mocked by South Park over the years, coming together and demanding that the show stop targeting them. The resolution of the plot involved Muhammad, presented as a figure whose image could not be shown without triggering dangerous reactions, being hidden inside a bear costume. The joke was entirely about the absurdity of the situation. The show was depicting the impossibility of depicting Muhammad, by having him hidden inside a bear costume and treating the whole setup as the joke. Before the episodes aired, an organization called Revolution Muslim, based in New York, posted a message online addressed to Parker and Stone. The message warned them that they risked the same fate as Theo Van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered by a religious extremist. The message included the address of the Comedy Central offices in New York. It stopped short of being a direct threat in a legal sense, but its implication was unmistakable. The people behind it were telling Parker and Stone that depicting Muhammad could cost them their lives. Comedy Central made the decision to censor the episodes. In the broadcast version of episode 201, the image of Muhammad was blacked out. His name was bleeped whenever characters said it in dialogue. Large portions of a speech at the end of the episode, which Parker and Stone later confirmed was supposed to be directly about the issue of censorship and what had just happened, was bleeped entirely, covering what would have been a direct statement about the situation. Parker and Stone were not consulted on these censorship decisions. They were presented with them after the fact. Their response was exactly what you would expect from two people who had spent 15 years refusing to create exceptions to their satirical standards. They issued a statement that made their position completely clear. They said that Comedy Central had censored their work, that the censorship had happened because of threats of violence, and that they found the entire situation to be a failure of the principles they had been operating by for the show's entire run. The statement did not attack Comedy Central in a way that burned the relationship down, but it did not pretend that what had happened was acceptable either. The man who had written the online warning, a person named Zachary Adam Chesser, was later arrested by American authorities. He was arrested not directly in connection with the threats against Parker and Stone, but because he was attempting to travel overseas to join the terrorist organization ISIS. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The person who had threatened Parker and Stone for depicting a religious figure was on his way to join a terrorist organization when he was caught. This is the actual world that South Park was operating in when it was fighting its censorship battles, not the polite world of advertisers withdrawing support or pressure groups writing complaint letters. A world where the threats were being made by people who were later convicted in connection with terrorist organizations. And even in that world, Parker and Stone's position was the same. If you mock one religion, you mock them all. If you are willing to show Buddha and Jesus and every other religious figure doing things their followers find offensive, you have to apply the same standard to Muhammad. Any exception creates a hierarchy. Any hierarchy says that some groups are more capable of violence and therefore more entitled to special treatment. Accepting that hierarchy in Parker and Stone's view was more dangerous and more dishonest than maintaining the standard even when the consequences were severe. There is an earlier episode that also deserves attention in this context, from season 9 in 2005, which dealt with the Church of Scientology in the way described in the previous section. The censorship battle around that episode had a different character, but the same essential structure. An organization used its connections and resources to pressure a network into pulling content. The network bent. Parker and Stone pushed back. The episode eventually returned to air. What is remarkable about both situations and about the show's 30-year run of fighting these battles is that it never stopped making the content that caused them. It never developed a list of subjects it would not touch. It never adopted the standard industry practice of preemptively softening anything that might generate the kind of controversy that had caused problems before. The Simpsons, to its credit, has also addressed religious topics over its run, but The Simpsons has never come close to the level of direct conflict with organized groups that South Park maintained as a regular feature of its existence. Family Guy has generated controversy and had episodes pulled, most notably an episode that involved a subplot the network refused to air, but its battles have been smaller and its willingness to push back more limited. No other animated show has fought on as many fronts, against as many organized and powerful opponents, for as long, as consistently, and with as much documented cost to the people making it. There is also the legal dimension of South Park's fight for its right to say what it wanted to say, which produced consequences that went beyond the show itself. In 2011, a company called Brown Mark Films sued Comedy Central over a South Park episode that parodied a specific viral internet video. The lawsuit claimed that the episode had used the original video without permission and that this was a violation of copyright. South Park won the case. The judge dismissed it. But the legal reasoning used to dismiss it, that the episode was a protected parody of the original because it had transformed the material into something new for satirical purposes, became a significant legal reference point that lawyers in copyright cases began citing regularly in the years that followed. A South Park episode that was itself a joke about internet culture ended up contributing to the legal framework that protects satirists and parodists in America. South Park did not just fight for its own right to say what it wanted to say, it inadvertently strengthened the legal protections for anyone else who wanted to do the same thing. Taking all of this together, the Scientology battle, the Muhammad censorship, the ongoing conflicts with religious groups, celebrities, corporations, and governments, the legal precedent created as a side effect of one of its episodes, South Park's record as a fighter for its own creative freedom is without any real parallel in animated television. Other shows have been controversial. Other shows have generated complaints and caused problems for their networks. But no other animated show has done it at this scale, across this range of targets, for this length of time, while maintaining such a clear and consistent philosophical position about why it was doing it. The position is simple. Satire that picks and chooses its targets based on who fights back hardest is not satire. It is just mockery of the weak. South Park refused to be that, even when being something more than that was genuinely dangerous. That refusal cost the show things. It cost Isaac Hayes his connection to the show he helped build. It produced real threats against the people who made it. It led to episodes being censored in ways that Parker and Stone found deeply objectionable. It got the show banned from the entire country of China after an episode in 2019 touched on topics that the Chinese government did not want discussed. Every one of those costs was accepted. The show kept going. But fighting for the right to say things is only half the story of what makes South Park different. The other half is whether the things it was saying were actually worth fighting for. Whether the quality of the show, the consistency of the writing, the sharpness of the ideas justified everything it went through to keep them on air. __quote_8___. For that answer, you have to look at how the show held together across 27 seasons, while almost every other animated show that started in the same era either fell apart or faded into a pale version of itself. That staying power is the next thing to understand. Section 8. Longevity without decay. Why South Park is still sharp at 27 seasons. While The Simpsons faded, there is a specific kind of disappointment that comes from watching a show you love get worse. It is different from just disliking a show. It carries something personal in it, because you remember what the show used to be. You remember the episodes that made you feel like the writers understood something true about the world. And then you watch a new episode and feel the absence of that quality so completely that the new episode almost makes the old ones feel worse by comparison. This disappointment has a name in television culture. It is called jumping the shark. The phrase comes from a moment in the show Happy Days, where a character literally jumped over a shark on water skis. And the moment was so obviously desperate and creatively bankrupt that people started using it to describe the point in any show's run where it stopped being what it used to be. Almost every long-running show eventually jumps the shark. The interesting question is not whether it will happen, but when and how, and whether the show has the self-awareness to see it. The Simpsons is the most discussed example of this in animated television history, and understanding what happened to The Simpsons is the clearest way to understand why what South Park did with its own longevity is so remarkable. The Simpsons premiered in December 1989. Its first 10 seasons, and particularly seasons 3 through 8, are considered by critics and fans to be among the greatest runs in the history of American television. The show was not just good animation, it was smart about American life in a way that felt genuinely new. It had characters with real emotional depth. Its jokes worked on multiple levels simultaneously. It could make you laugh and feel something real within the same scene. Writers from that era included people who went on to become among the most respected voices in comedy, and the scripts they produced in those years remain studied and quoted decades later. Something began to change around seasons 9 and 10. The show started relying on celebrity guest appearances more heavily. The plots started to feel like they were assembled from familiar pieces rather than driven by genuine ideas. The emotional sincerity that had made Homer and Marge and the kids feel real started giving way to a more cartoonish version of the same family that prioritized jokes over truth. Critics noticed. Writers on the show noticed. Some of the writers who had been there during the best years left. Others stayed and described in later interviews the feeling of the show operating on a kind of momentum and brand recognition rather than actual creative energy. One writer, when asked how the show kept going after the quality declined, made a joke that became one of the most quoted lines about the show. He said, "Lower your quality standards and you can go on forever." The Simpsons did go on forever, or close enough to it. As of now, it has aired over 800 episodes across more than 35 seasons. It has been renewed through season 40. It will almost certainly become the longest-running primetime scripted series in American history, by any measure before it finally ends. But for most of the last 20 years, the conversation about The Simpsons has been organized around the question of when it stopped being worth watching, not whether it did. This is the fate that almost every long-running show meets. The energy that made it special in its early years is almost impossible to sustain across decades. decades. The writers who created the original voice move on or burn out. The cultural moment that the show was responding to when it launched moves on too. The show either changes and loses what made it work, or stays the same and becomes a repetitive version of itself. South Park has been running since 1997. It is on its 27th season, and the conversation about South Park, as of its most recent seasons, is not about when it stopped being worth watching. It is about what it has been doing with its format, whether specific recent choices were the right ones, and where it goes next. These are the conversations you have about a show that is still alive creatively. The Simpsons conversation stopped sounding like that a long time ago. How did South Park avoid the decay that got The Simpsons? The first answer is structural, and it goes back to the production model described in Section 1. Because South Park makes its episodes in a single week, responding to what is actually happening in the world right now, it is almost impossible for the show to become culturally irrelevant in the way The Simpsons did. The Simpsons became increasingly out of step with the cultural moment, partly because its production timeline was so long that it was always commenting on a world that no longer existed by the time the episode aired. South Park cannot have this problem. The show that aired this week was written this week. It is responding to the world as it is, not the world as it was 8 months ago. This structural advantage is significant, but it is not the whole answer. The second answer is that Parker and Stone made a deliberate creative decision in season 18, in 2014, that very few long-running shows have had the courage or the self-awareness to make. They changed the format. For 17 seasons, South Park had operated primarily as an episodic show. Each episode was largely self-contained. You did not have to have watched the previous episode to understand what was happening. Characters did not carry memories or consequences from one episode to the next in any sustained way. This is the format that most animated comedies use, because it makes the show easier to broadcast in reruns, easier for new viewers to enter, and easier to produce without having to maintain careful track of what has happened before. Starting in season 18, Parker and Stone began structuring entire seasons as single connected stories. Characters carried memories. Events from earlier episodes had consequences later in the same season. A decision made in the second episode might not fully play out until the 9th. The show became, at least in structural terms, more like a serial drama and less like a collection of individual comedy episodes. This was a significant creative risk. The same 6-day production model that made individual episodes fast to make made a season-long connected story extremely difficult to execute. If you were writing episode 8 and episode 3 painted you into a corner you did not anticipate, you cannot go back and change episode 3. It has already aired. You have to find a way forward from where you are. Parker and Stone accepted this constraint and used it. The pressure of the serialized format, combined with the production speed, produced seasons that felt genuinely urgent in a way that the earlier episodic seasons sometimes did not. The stakes felt higher because choices had consequences. The audience was watching something build rather than watching a series of separate events. Then, in 2016, the show attempted something even more ambitious. Season 20 was constructed as a single 200-episode-long narrative that built toward the outcome of the real American presidential election. Parker and Stone made the decision to tie the entire season's plot to the expectation of a specific election result. When the actual election produced a different result than expected, they had to rewrite the final episodes in real time, using their 6-day production model while the season was still airing. The season is generally considered one of the weaker ones in the show's run, partly because the real-world events it was built around did not cooperate with the story it was trying to tell. But the attempt itself is worth examining. Almost no other long-running show would try something that risky in its 20th season. Most shows in their 20th season are running on habits and brand recognition. They are not trying new things that could fail spectacularly. South Park tried. It did not fully work. The show learned from it and moved on. This willingness to attempt things that could fail and to absorb the failure and keep going is part of what has kept the show alive. Compare this to Family Guy, which premiered in 1999, 2 years after South Park. Family Guy was canceled after its 3rd season in 2002, brought back in 2005 after strong DVD sales demonstrated that the audience was still there, and has been running continuously since then. The revival Family Guy is a different show from the original in some ways that its most devoted fans can describe in detail. It has gotten louder and more cartoonish, and less attached to its characters as real people with consistent personalities. The emotional grounding that the early seasons occasionally found has become increasingly rare. The show runs on the momentum of its format rather than the energy of its ideas. Futurama, which ran alongside South Park for part of its run and overlapped with it culturally, was canceled twice and revived twice. Its most recent revival on Hulu has been received warmly by fans who who love the show, but even its supporters generally acknowledge that it does not hit the heights of its best early seasons with any consistency. The show is running on its own legacy as much as on new creative energy. Rick and Morty is the youngest of the shows in this comparison, and its trajectory is not yet fully clear, but the gap between seasons has grown. Season 4 came out years after Season 3. The departure of one of the show's creators after Season 6 created a real and documented uncertainty about whether the show could maintain what had made it work. Season 7, made without that creator, received broadly positive reviews, but the question of whether the show's best days are behind it is already being asked, less than 10 years into its run. South Park has been running for 27 years. The most recent deal Parker and Stone signed, completed in 2025, is worth $1.5 billion and covers 5 more seasons plus 50 new episodes. The deal was described by the head of Paramount as making South Park one of the most valuable television franchises in the world. He said the show was more popular at the time of the deal than at any point in its entire history. More popular than at any point in its history, 27 years in. When The Simpsons was 27 years old, the conversation about it was primarily about decline. When South Park reached the same age, streaming services were in a bidding war over who got to carry it. The financial numbers around South Park's longevity are worth sitting with for a moment because they say something concrete about how the show has maintained its value in a way that pure critical discussion sometimes misses. In 2019, the rights to stream the show were sold to HBO Max in a deal worth $500 million. 2 years later, the deal with Viacom CBS was signed for $900 million, covering new seasons and original films. Then the 2025 deal at $1.5 billion replaced and extended that. These are not the numbers of a show that peaked in 2003 and has been coasting since. These are the numbers of a property that gets more valuable over time. The reason for that increasing value is that South Park has done something almost no entertainment property of its age manages to do. It has kept acquiring new audiences while holding on to old ones. People who were children when the show launched in 1997 are now in their 30s and 40s, and many of them still watch. But the show is also continuously relevant to people who are discovering it for the first time because the topics it addresses are current and the humor is not locked in a specific moment the way humor from the late 1990s usually is. The Simpsons feels like it belongs to a specific era even when it is producing new episodes because its sensibility and its approach were formed in that era and have not fully evolved beyond it. South Park does not feel like it belongs to a specific era because it is rebuilt from scratch every single week in response to what the world is doing right now. This is the full picture of South Park's longevity. It is not just that the show has kept going. Plenty of shows keep going long after they should have stopped. It is that the show has kept going while remaining genuinely worth watching, genuinely relevant, and genuinely valuable in ways that can be measured in both cultural terms and financial ones. Most shows that last 20 years become museums. They keep running as a tribute to what they once were, and the audience that stays with them does so out of loyalty and habit rather than genuine excitement about what comes next. South Park kept coming back every season and giving people genuine reasons to pay attention. But the reason it could do that, the reason the quality held and the ideas stayed sharp, comes down to something that most discussions of the show overlook completely. It comes down to the specific way Parker and Stone were taught to write, and the rule they developed about how stories should be constructed that separates South Park's writing from every other animated show at a fundamental level. __quote_9___. That rule is simple enough to explain in a single sentence, but understanding what it does to an episode and why it matters so much requires taking it apart carefully. That is exactly what we are going to do next. Section 9, the Quote 10 Rule, why South Park's writing architecture outclasses every other cartoon. There is a version of bad storytelling that almost everyone has sat through without being able to name exactly what was wrong with it. You are watching a show, things happen, a character does something, then something else happens, then another thing happens. You follow each individual moment without difficulty, nothing is confusing. But somewhere around the middle of the episode, you realize you are not particularly interested in what happens next. You are watching out of habit rather than genuine curiosity. The episode ends. You could not tell someone the next day what it was actually about or why any of it mattered. This feeling has a specific cause. The cause is the word and. When a story is built on and, it is a list. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. A list of events is not a story. It is a sequence. You can follow a sequence without caring about it. The events do not create pull. Nothing feels inevitable or earned. You are just moving from one thing to the next because that is what sequences do. Trey Parker identified this problem and built a rule around solving it. He has talked about this rule in interviews, and it is documented in the Emmy-nominated documentary 6 Days to Air. The rule is simple enough to explain explain in one sentence. Replace every and in your story with either but or therefore. This happens, therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. But and therefore are not neutral connecting words the way and is. They carry logic. Therefore means the next thing is a direct result of what just happened. But means the next thing is a problem, a complication, a turn that was not expected. When you build a story out of these two words instead of and, every scene has a relationship with the scene before it. Events cause other events. Problems create other problems. The audience is always slightly ahead of the story, asking what happens next, because what happens next matters. It is connected to what just happened. It will connect to what comes after. Parker has said this is the biggest single reason why South Park episodes hit differently than other animated shows. Not the speed of production, not the willingness to be offensive, not the cultural commentary, the fundamental architecture of how the stories are built. The and versus but and therefore distinction. Let's look at what this actually does to a real episode. Take the season 12 episode called About Last Night, the one that aired less than 24 hours after the 2008 presidential election result. The episode is built around Obama winning the election. The surface story is the town of South Park reacting to the result. Half the town is celebrating, the other half is devastated. A weaker show would build this episode on and Obama wins and people celebrate and other people are sad and there are jokes about both reactions and the episode ends. This is a sequence. It has moments. It is probably funny in places, but it does not go anywhere with any real force. South Park builds it differently. Obama wins, therefore the town splits into two completely different emotional states, but the split reveals something unexpected about how people on both sides are behaving. Therefore the episode can now comment on something true about what election results actually do to people. But then it adds a second layer to the plot that reframes the entire election as something else entirely. Therefore the ending lands as a genuine surprise rather than just a conclusion. The but and therefore structure means the episode is always moving, not just forward in time, but forward in argument. Each scene makes the next scene possible and necessary. By the end, you have not just watched a funny episode about election night, you have watched something that made a specific point and earned it through the way the story was constructed. This is what separates South Park's writing from Family Guy's writing most visibly. Family Guy is built almost entirely on and. The main story of any given episode is usually a thin thread that exists primarily to connect cutaway gags. A cutaway gag is by definition an and. The scene stops, something unrelated happens, then the scene resumes. The cutaway does not create a therefore or a but. It creates a pause, a separate joke, a reference, and then a return to where you were. The story did not move. The argument did not develop. You just saw something funny and now you are back where you were. Family Guy's cutaway format is entertaining. It produces moments that are funny in isolation, but it cannot produce the feeling of a story that is going somewhere with purpose because the format actively interrupts that feeling every few minutes by design. The ands just pile up. The episode ends not because anything was resolved, but because the running time ran out. The Simpsons at its best was better than this. The golden era Simpsons episodes, particularly from seasons 3 through 8, had real story architecture. They used but and therefore even without naming the rule. Homer wants something, therefore he pursues it, but the pursuit creates a problem, therefore the problem escalates, but the escalation reveals something true about him, therefore the resolution lands with emotional weight. These are the episodes people still quote 25 years later. They are remembered not just because they were funny, but because they were constructed well enough that the funny moments had stakes. But the late era Simpsons lost this. The episodes started running on and again. Homer does something, and then something happens, and then something else happens, and then it gets resolved. The plots feel assembled from familiar pieces rather than built from actual ideas. The rule Parker articulated is not something the Simpsons writers ever formally stopped following, but the energy behind following it faded. The commitment to making every scene earn the next one faded with it. Rick and Morty uses but and therefore well in its best episodes. The show's creator Dan Harmon, who built his career on a specific understanding of story structure, applies real rigor to how scenes connect. Rick and Morty's best episodes feel argued rather than just assembled. But the show's production schedule, with its years-long gaps between seasons, means it produces a fraction of the volume of South Park, and the consistency across a full season is harder to maintain than within individual episodes. South Park applies the but and therefore rule to every episode, every week, across a season of 10 to 12 episodes, using a 6-day production window. The volume at which the rule gets applied successfully is genuinely extraordinary. There are weak episodes, there are seasons that feel less consistent than others, but the structural commitment to making stories work as arguments rather than sequences is visible throughout the run in a way that no other animated show has matched at the same pace. Parker also talks about a connected idea idea, which is that the best South Park episodes have a moment somewhere in the middle where you can feel the argument the episode is making click into place. You suddenly understand not just what is happening in the story, but what the story is about, what point it is building toward. This moment of clarity is only possible if the but and therefore structure has been doing its work in the scenes before it. The clarity is earned by the architecture. When that moment happens in a South Park episode, it produces a very specific feeling that is different from just finding something funny. It is the feeling of being surprised by the direction something went, and then immediately recognizing that it was the only direction it could have gone. The story felt inevitable in retrospect, even though you did not see it coming. This is what well-built story architecture produces. It is also what distinguishes a show that is working from a show that is just continuing. The rule also explains something about why the serialized seasons that South Park moved into after season 17 were both the show's most ambitious and its most difficult to execute. When you apply but and therefore to a single 22-minute episode, you are managing a relatively contained set of connections. When you apply it across a 10-episode season where every episode must connect to the ones before and after it, the demands multiply. Every but and therefore within an individual episode also has to connect to the larger but and therefore of the season as a whole. Parker has acknowledged the difficulty of this. He has said that the 6-day production model makes long-form serialized storytelling genuinely hard because you are making decisions about episode 8 before you have fully resolved what episode 5 means. The fact that it has worked as often as it has across the serialized seasons is a testament to how deeply the rule is embedded in how Parker and Stone think about stories at every level, from individual scenes up to season-long arcs. No other animated show has articulated and applied a writing principle this clearly, this consistently, and at this volume. The shows that apply similar thinking do it more slowly, with more time between episodes, with more opportunity to go back and fix what is not working. South Park does it in 6 days, week after week, season after season. The rule sounds simple. Replace and with but or therefore. But applying it under the conditions South Park applies it, at the pace South Park applies it, is one of the genuine craft achievements of the show's run. It is the least visible thing about South Park and possibly the most important, because when you watch a South Park episode that works, you are feeling the but and therefore rule doing its job without knowing that is what you are feeling. You are just experiencing the pull of a story that knows where it is going and is taking you there with purpose. You are leaning forward slightly. You are curious. You want to know what happens next because what happens next has been made to matter. Every other animated show on television is trying to create that same feeling. Most of them manage it occasionally, in their best episodes, in their best seasons. South Park manages it by the rule, by the specific, named, documented principle that its creator identified and committed to and has applied for 27 years. That principle, combined with everything else, the speed, the visual philosophy, the specific worldview, the complexity of Cartman, the willingness to fight for its right to exist, the longevity without decay, produces something that has had a measurable, documented, real-world impact unlike anything else in the history of animated television. And that impact is what the final section of this essay is about. __quote _11__. Because South Park did not just survive. It did not just stay sharp. It changed things. Real things. Outside the television. In the world. That is where we finish. Section 10. The Real World Machine. When South Park stopped reflecting culture and started changing it. Most television shows describe the world. The good ones describe it accurately. The great ones describe it in a way that makes you see something you had not noticed before. But almost all of them, even the very best ones, exist on one side of a clear line. They are observers. They watch what happens and they report back. South Park crossed that line at some point in its run, and it is genuinely difficult to identify exactly when it happened because it happened gradually and then all at once. South Park stopped being a show that commented on the world and became a show that was part of the machinery of the world. Not a mirror held up to culture, an actual force operating inside of it, a thing that made other things happen. The evidence for this is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is documented, it is specific, it is measurable, and it has no real parallel in the history of American animated television. Start with the most concrete example. In 2005, South Park aired Trapped in the Closet, the episode about Scientology described in Section 6. The episode presented the inner theology of the Church of Scientology to a mainstream audience, with a caption confirming that nothing had been exaggerated. Within the church, this information was considered private and was only shared with members who had spent years and significant money working working their way up through the organization's internal levels. After the episode aired, public awareness of Scientology's core beliefs changed. Former members described the episode as a significant factor in how ordinary people came to understand what the church actually taught. The niece of the church's current leader said she learned her own organization's foundational beliefs from watching it. A journalist who covered the church in the years following the episode documented what he described as a shift in public perception that tracked directly to the episode's airing. One cartoon episode moved public opinion against a real organization with real resources and a documented history of aggressive responses to negative coverage. Not the news, not a documentary, a flat animated show made in 6 days by 2 men doing most of the voices themselves. Now go wider. South Park has been banned from the entire country of China. The ban happened in 2019, following the airing of a season 23 episode called Banned in China. The episode touched on topics that the Chinese government considered unacceptable, including references to censorship and the treatment of people in labor camps. The response from the Chinese government was total. Every reference to South Park was removed from Chinese social media. The show's pages on Chinese websites were deleted. All keywords related to the show were blocked from searches on Chinese platforms. Parker and Stone responded by publishing a statement that has since become one of the most quoted things either of them has ever said. The statement said that they were grateful for the Chinese censorship because it confirmed everything the episode had been about. They said they stood 100% behind the Chinese government and its right to censor things they did not like, in the same tone they had used to mock Scientology years earlier. The statement was widely understood as a direct and deliberate mockery of the censorship, rather than an actual expression of support. A cartoon made by 2 people in Colorado got itself banned by the most populous country on Earth. The Simpsons has never been banned by a major world government. Family Guy has not. Futurama has not. Rick and Morty has not. South Park has. That is a measurement of real-world impact so concrete that no amount of cultural analysis is needed to confirm it. When governments ban things, it is because those things have actual power in the actual world. Now look at the political impact, which is harder to measure but equally real. A generation of American men, particularly those who were teenagers and young adults in the late 1990s and early 2000s, grew up with South Park as a primary source of how they understood political satire. The show's consistent message that both political parties were equally ridiculous, that caring too much about politics was embarrassing, and that the smartest position was the one that could see through everyone else's position, created what commentators have called South Park Republicans. This was a real and documented phenomenon. The term was used in actual political writing to describe a real group of voters who were socially moderate, economically uncertain in their politics, deeply skeptical of institutional authority, and influenced in their basic political instincts by the sensibility of the show. The fact that a cartoon had a documented influence on a real political identity is remarkable by itself. No other animated show has produced anything similar. The Simpsons influenced how people thought about suburban American life. Family Guy influenced how people thought about what was acceptable to joke about. South Park influenced how an actual identifiable group of people thought about politics, institutions, and the question of whether organized effort to change things was worth taking seriously. That is a different category of impact entirely. Then there is the legal impact, described briefly in Section 7 but worth examining in full here. In 2011, a company sued Comedy Central over a South Park episode that parodied a viral internet video. The lawsuit claimed the episode had used the original video without permission. South Park won the case. The judge's reasoning in dismissing the lawsuit established a clear legal principle about what counted as protected parody rather than theft of someone else's creative work. The ruling stated that the episode had taken the original material and transformed it into something new for satirical purposes, and that this transformation was exactly what the law was designed to protect. Lawyers began citing this ruling in other cases. It became a reference point in entertainment law for anyone arguing that their satirical or comedic use of existing material was protected. A South Park episode produced as a joke about internet culture created a legal foundation that other satirists and comedians have been able to use to defend their own work. No other animated show in history has accidentally created legal precedent while making a comedy episode. Now look at the show's relationship with its own parent company, which produced one of the most recent and most direct examples of the show's real-world power. In 2025, South Park opened its 27th season with an episode that directly mocked the merger between Paramount, the company that owns Comedy Central and therefore owns the network that airs South Park, and another company called Skydance. Parker and Stone had publicly described the merger as a mess that was causing problems for the show's production and its streaming deals. They had threatened legal action action against the incoming leadership of the new combined company. When the deals were finally settled, the show's first episode back was a direct, named, specific attack on the very corporation that had just signed them to a $1.5 billion deal. The episode aired one day after the deal was finalized. Parker and Stone used the 6-day production model to write, animate, and broadcast an episode mocking their own network and its owners within 24 hours of signing a contract that gave those owners significant power over the show's future. And the owners aired it because the deal was done, because South Park had enough power in the relationship that there was nothing to be done about it, because $1.5 billion buys a lot of latitude. This is not a show that describes power. This is a show that has power. Real, documented financial and creative power over the institutions that technically own it. The totality of South Park's real-world impact across its 27-year run is unlike anything else in the history of American animation when you lay it all out at once. It changed public perception of a major religious organization. It got banned by a world government. It helped shape an identifiable political identity in American culture. It created legal precedent in entertainment law. It mocked its own network the day after signing a deal worth more than $1 billion, and the network aired it anyway. It produced a documentary about its own production process that was nominated for an Emmy. It generated a Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, co-created by Parker and Stone, that won 9 Tony Awards and became one of the longest-running shows in Broadway history. The Broadway musical deserves a moment here. Parker and Stone created The Book of Mormon using the same sensibility and many of the same targets that South Park had been working with for years. It opened in 2011 and won the Tony Award for Best Musical. It ran on Broadway for over a decade. It has been performed in cities around the world. It is widely described as one of the most successful musicals of its era, and it grew directly out of the same creative philosophy that produced South Park's most effective religious satire. A crude animated show about 4 children in a Colorado mountain town produced 2 human beings whose creative work spread across animation, Broadway, and film, and whose combined deals have been worth billions of dollars, not because they built a safe and careful entertainment brand, but because they refused to do that at every single decision point across 30 years. No other animated show produced anything like this. Not because the people behind other shows were less talented, but because no other show maintained the specific combination of creative values that made this possible. The speed, the visual philosophy, the consistent worldview, the complex characters, the willingness to fight, the structural writing discipline, the refusal to become comfortable or predictable or safe. South Park earned every dollar of that $1.5 billion deal, not as a legacy payment to a show that used to matter, as a present tense recognition of a show that still does. That is the full picture. A show that started as a crude joke made by 2 film students using paper cutouts has spent 27 years building something with more real-world impact than almost any animated property in the history of the medium. Something that changed how people think, what governments ban, how courts rule, and how much a network is willing to pay to keep it on air. Every other cartoon made for adults in the same era has a legacy. The Simpsons has a golden age that people still study. Family Guy has episodes that still circulate. Rick and Morty has a passionate following. South Park has all of that and something none of them have. It has a measurable effect on the actual world outside the screen. That is what destroying every other cartoon actually means. Not beating them in a ratings race, not outscoring them on critic lists. Doing something they never did and never will. Becoming real. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.